Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us in this afternoon session. I hope you all had a wonderful lunch. You had some coffee to get through the afternoon sessions. So it is my pleasure to introduce the panel discussion that the Young Academy of Europe has put together for Building Bridges 2021. The topic is redefining rewards and recognitions for European scholars. And I will first have a few slides of an introduction, and then we'll move on to this truly hybrid experience where we have two of us are here in Barcelona, and then we have three people joining us online. So the topic of today, redefining rewards and recognitions for European scholars. I wanted to start by giving a very short overview of the Young Academy of Europe. A couple of slides for those of you who are not familiar with who we are and what we do and how can people join us. Sorry, it doesn't seem to be, oh, there we go. So the Young Academy of Europe is a pan-European initiative of outstanding young researchers for networking, science advice, scientific exchange, and science policy. Young Academy of Europe fellows, they demonstrate leadership, so they're typically young principal investigators who can support their own research group with an external grant. Their research is recognized at national and international levels and have an interest in science policy. This is just an overview, a snapshot of our mission and what we do. We do a lot on science, science policy, science advice. So for example, with participation in European scientific advice, with the newly created YASAs that Professor Sir Kluting also described yesterday. We work on policy for science. So we work closely, for example, with the Initiative for Science in Europe, for open science, researcher evaluation and careers and research precarity. We also have a mission of networking. So among our members, but also with established leaders in academia, for example, as in the Academia Europaea. We also work in science communication. We organize online symposiums and webinars. And we also have a science outreach task force. The last year saw the launch of the YAE task forces. Interdisciplinary exchange, so among our members, and also we have a transdisciplinary research task force. And finally, we have a strong emphasis on equality, diversity, and inclusion. We have an unconscious bias declaration. We have a grant, a Caliper grant, which is a cost to really work to close the gender gap in academia. And we have an EDI task force as well. So the last year continued to see our growth. We accept nominations on a rolling basis. And this has been the selection committee over the past year, Ariel Husby, Pavel Korpal, and Giulia Garanzini. We very much welcome nominations from members of the Academia Europaea, and if there's any doubts about a candidate, we can discuss this on a case-by-case basis. Briefly, the eligibility criteria, the candidate must demonstrate leadership. So this is typically someone who leads their own research group with their own funding. Is within 12 years of receiving their PhD award, but we do give credit for carrying periods taken off for carrying responsibilities, for example. Currently works in one of the member states of the European Union or in an associated country as defined by ERC application rules. And in our website, there's also an exhaustive list of all the countries that can apply. Has an interest in science advice. So policy, of course, shows research excellence. For example, meaning being recognized by peers, attracting external funding, and showing scientific independence. And can provide 2 referee letters from members of the Young Academy of Europe or the Academia Europaea or a National Young Academy from 2 different countries. And this is to show that the individual has established a collaboration, transnational network of collaborations. So today we are concerned with the topic of redefining rewards and recognitions for European scholars. And we have assembled a stellar panel of 4 experts that will provide their perspective on this topic. We will then open it for a Q&A with those of you who are here and those online that I will be moderating. And I'm hoping it's going to be a lively discussion where we can all contribute our views towards the common goal of improving our community, our fields. So the main question really is, how can we improve the assessment of researchers and academics? How do we ensure that it's not just about a journal impact, or that we just not reward individual work, but we reward collaborations and collaborative leadership? How does the assessment of researchers reflect the changes in open science and open access practices? And how do we make sure that evaluation practices move away from metrics and indexes that exacerbate inequalities across European countries and reinforce perhaps systemic biases? So how can we move away to make this more comprehensive of the reality of research careers? And so to answer these questions, we will have Michael Murphy here in person, President of the European University Association. We'll have Kostas Glinos, Head of Open Science of the European Commission, who is joining us online. Professor Moniek Tromp, who is Vice-Chair of the Young Academy of Europe, also a board member of the NWO Domain Science and the Dutch Network of Women Professors. And Professor Rebecca Lawrence, who is Managing Director of F1000 Research. So this is the end of my bit, and I will now give the floor to Professor Murphy to start giving a 5-minute introduction to the topic, and then we will follow with the rest. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gemma. Thank you for the invitation. I just might set out by providing some context to the discussion from 10,000 meters or 40,000 feet by describing what's happening in the university sector. First thing to say is that there is no confusion at the leadership level in the European university sector about the need to address this question. At EUA, and for those not familiar with it, it's the body that represents about 850 universities and national rectors' conferences across Europe, beyond the Urals. This year, we published the conclusions of an analysis going back over the past year, where we consulted everybody about how universities must adapt to the challenges facing us. If you Google a document called Universities Without Walls, a vision for 2030, you will see briefly set out the scale of the evolutionary challenge that we face if universities are to support society in meeting the big challenges. Practically everything that we do will have to change and evolve, whether it be learning from unblended campuses to more learning in the workplace, more engagement with civic society, and civic society setting the curricular agenda and the research agenda. So major changes in how learning will happen. In the research domain, we reiterate something that we did originally in 2007, a commitment to open science and open access, because that's what builds trust among society in what we do. And we see citizens much more engaged in all aspects of science. For all of this to happen, we set out the enablers in the control of government and in the control of universities. But absolutely key is the need to reform academic assessment and career assessment in universities, including research assessment. So we are committed in policy terms and strategically to this happening. Now, what's the story? Where are we at? Well, we have surveyed our universities to find out what the gap is between our aspirations and what we do. And there is a gap. Some 270 universities responded to us in our most recent iteration. And on the matter of research careers, yes, research publications and grant winning remains critical. 99% regard that as critical in evaluating research performance. Teaching doesn't really feature. The ability to teach, even though most of young researchers aspire to becoming academics. Only 15% of universities regard teaching capabilities as important in assessing. Societal outreach and knowledge transfer, which we regard in policy terms as very important, were deemed unimportant by a third of universities. 40% of universities deem open access and open science as not being very important in assessing research careers at the present time. This is reported by the universities. In fact, only a half of the universities in Europe have had policies formally to support open science within their institution. When it comes then to the assessment of the individual, it's numbers of publications and citations. 60% of universities regard those as the key elements of assessment. And on the other hand, open science metrics, altmetrics, and so on, are deemed completely unimportant by almost half universities at the present time. And it's the journal impact factor and the H index that come top of the pile. 3/4 of institutions regarding those as primary metrics. So my last contribution at this point is to answer the question briefly, why the gap between the rhetoric and policy on the one hand and reality of implementation on the other? We asked that question, and the answers that we got were complexity of reform. Complexity is the first challenge. Lack of institutional capacity, the second. Resistance to research assessment reform by researchers was next. And then increased costs, limited awareness of potential benefits, and paucity of incentivizing policies from external actors. Now, that's my first message. We have the policies, but there's a gap between those and what happens, and the discussion might focus on how the various influencers can work together to bridge the gap. That's context.
Great, thank you very much, Michael. It's important to have the data, so it's really a good contribution to start our panel. So to continue, I'd like to invite Professor Kostas Glinos from the European Commission to give his 5-minute introduction. Please, Kostas, thank you.
Thank you very much. I come from the Commission, I head the Open Science unit that is the Director General for Research and Innovation. And this is a topic that we are very working intensely on for the last year. It is clear that the system needs reform. It does not correspond to the nature of research and of innovation today. Does not favor quality, it favors quantity. It does not favor impact. It does not reward things like teamwork and collaboration. It does not reward contributions to the community. It's clear, everybody, I think almost everybody will agree that the system is in need of reform. And this is known for some time. It's not today that we discover it, but reform has been, or change has been very slow, painful. There are powerful forces against it. Michael described some of this. The whole thing is very much ingrained in culture, and culture changes with a lot of difficulty. And early career researchers are caught in the middle of this. They are caught in a spiral where you never get out. How do you call this? You go around and you hope at some point to change, but it's not possible, because when at the early stages of your career, you may be in favor, and I'm sure that the vast majority of early career researchers are in favor of this change. But you have to play by the rules. If you want to get promoted, the understanding of many is that, okay, I have to play by the rules. The system is what it is. It's not me who is going to change it, correct? And therefore, I have to play by the rules. So the majority will play by the rules and will postpone action till later. But then later, when they get into a more secure position, they have to think about the welfare of their students or the people they mentor, the younger generations. And again, they have to advise them, and very often they will advise them, to go to get this famous, much desired publication is out of this other journal, and again, change is postponed. So I think the early career researchers is a powerful force if it's harnessed correctly, and if it becomes far more vocal than it is today. I don't think it's heard loud enough, especially at the managers of large institutions or universities or the political world. The Commission is prepared to take an initiative in that direction, an initiative that we are facilitating, catalyzing. We have started a consultation process in March this year, and we are close to the end of it. Our idea right now, following discussions with many stakeholders, including some of you, is to create a coalition of the willing, if you want, of those who do the assessment. In other words, institutions, universities on the one hand, and funders of research on the other, because the two systems, how funders assess institutions and assess proposals, should be consistent with how institutions assess their employees, so researchers and professors. So to a coalition of those institutions, of those funders that are willing to commit to change the system on the basis of a concrete set of principles that we have been developing. I think we are almost there regarding the principles, as well as, and this is what was missing so far, a concrete timetable for reforms. So a commitment that by that time, I will have changed that in my evaluation system as an employer or as a university or as a funder. And we would like to launch this in the beginning of next year. There is already an event from the French presidency of the European Union planned on this on the 4th and 5th of February in Paris. We have so far a strong political backing to have such an initiative, to do real change from the ministries of the member states of the European Union, who have been continuously talking to them. We have been in interaction with many other stakeholders. But again, and with this I finish, I think that the organizations like the Young Academy of Europe, or the other organizations of individual researchers, early career researchers or young researchers, should have an important role to play. And their, again, voice should be far more loudly heard than has been the case till now. Because at the end of the day, there will be many in practice that will argue against changing the system. They will find, and there are many arguments that one could use against the change, or actually what may happen is that everybody will agree on the long-term objectives, but many will think that postponing action till the subject is more ripe, more mature, is a better way to go. Not be the first one to stick the neck out, not have my university fall in the international rankings, or all kinds of reasons can be found to make this basically to agree on some general principles, but make the reform ineffective. So the young researchers collectively, not individually, are the ones that are absolutely necessary if we want this reform to happen. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kostas. That was a good call for action to young researchers. And here is where this leads really nicely onto Professor Moniek Tromp, who will offer her views in her different roles representing the interests of young and mid-career researchers in this topic. Moniek, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Gemma. Thanks, everyone. I think a lot of my comments will echo what has been said before, but I will make them anyway. So I don't have to explain to you what the YAE is doing because Gemma has just done this. But what is important for this discussion is, of course, that we as YAE stand for science and science careers of young researchers and from a young researcher's perspective. And we want them to excel and at the same time increase their presence and influence in important tables where science for policy and policy for science is discussed and decided upon. So it is for us, for that reason, that on the one hand, we engage, for example, in the EU science advice mechanisms, initially via our association with the Academia Europaea, but from next year on, hopefully more solidly via the new YAE Plus project. On the other hand, we are very active within, for example, Initiative for Science in Europe, where we collaborate with other young as well as learned societies to make an impact or try to make an impact. It is also in that context that we have worked more specifically on themes as open science and research careers, both important for this discussion today. And I have to admit that also in my role as board member of the Dutch Research Foundation, I'm also heavily involved in this, where the Netherlands is taking a lead in the open science as well as recognition and rewarding movements. Well, as has already been said, in the current academic climate with high working load, which is still increasing for all of us, scientists need to act as sheep with 5 legs. It's a very Dutch expression, but I think it works in English as well. We lose many good people, good scientists in this system, also due to the lack of positions and funding. Many scientists, especially young ones, move from one short temporary position to the other, and at the same time we see that the system is not diverse and inclusive, and more problems with scientific integrity and harassment surface. So the pressure on the system discourages especially young people to contribute to important tasks like change, like science policy, since they do not advance their careers directly, as the system is now. And we actually see ourselves within YAE that scientists, young scientists, are forbidden by their management to engage in these activities. At the same time, current crises in the world required large collaborative inter- and multidisciplinary approaches between older and younger generation of scientists, but also much broader with companies, societies, and especially these governments. It is for all these reasons that the university is changing, and a lot of the common and perhaps more old-fashioned procedures which were in place are under discussion, as just been said already. And whereas the leadership might see the urgency, as just mentioned, not all people in the system see this. And there's a lot of discussion and worries by the senior established academics, but especially also by the young people who are worried about their own position. So I fully agree that we need to take action. So what do we do? And to be a bit more specific, well, we see that the academic system is hyper competitive. There's limited funding, there's limited position, and researchers are under pressure from universities, funding agencies, journals to produce breakthroughs at every publication. Evaluation parameters like the use of age index, impact factor, number of citations, those have been used to decide and are still used to decide on funding, but also on the status and career progression of academics. Research into these numeric assessment factors have shown that there's a lot of bias in this system. And at the same time, research cannot always be innovative and groundbreaking at every stage. But the pressure is high, status and funding depend on it, so the results are pushed through thickly in the highest profile papers, and as such sometimes incomplete or even falsified, leading to science integrity and harassment. And the overall funding for research decreases in many places, making it hard for people to be able to do research at all. So again, the system is under pressure and change is required, and at least we all agree on that. And this is of course, happening, as just mentioned as well. And I guess the Netherlands, but also Scandinavian countries, and I think the UK is also working, moving forward, are quite far in the process here. But I have to say that especially Dutch scientists find this scary in itself, because it will only work if we all do this and not if just the Dutch do it. So I want to emphasize also here is that the move to open science and fair principles is of course very linked to this whole recognition and rewarding discussion. So they have to be taken together. So in the Netherlands, what is happening with respect to recognition and rewarding, more concretely, is that, for example, people are not just on just their age index or impact factor anymore, but a completely different rewarding system is being introduced based on the full set of activities people do and want to be judged upon. So it's in dialogue. Academics do not just publish, but they're involved in management, teaching, science, policy advice. And if the assessment criteria for both career and funding diversify, the pressure on the system and on people will hopefully decrease. The idea is that people will excel in their qualities and strengths rather than all trying to do everything and only be judged for a few. So for science and science funding, this might, for example, mean being judged on the science proposal and a narrative CV where you explain how your background and strengths fit best the proposal. In the Netherlands, we have multiple working groups at all universities, but also the academies as well as funding agencies working together on this to ensure proper assessment of research as well as individual careers. And to be honest, some policy or management tasks might actually give more impact than 1 or 2 extra high-profile publications. However, and we have already noticed that at the Dutch Research Foundation, is that it is, of course, very important that we all, applicants, reviewers, committees, managers, learn how to do this, how to assess people in the new system, and that we do not introduce new or different biases in the system. Recognition and rewarding is not per se a silver bullet to solve everything and needs to be done carefully and together, preferably worldwide. That was my.
Great, thank you very much, Monique. I think now we have a good transition as well here to Rebecca, because we're talking about, we highlighted the issues, and now we can move into examples of implementing these changes into rewards and recognition. So Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gemma, and thank you for the invitation to talk. Just to explain my background, so I'm from F1000, which is an open research publisher, and have been involved in the Open Science Policy Platform, working with the Commission, among other things. So I was going to talk more about sort of the implementation side of this. And I think we all agree on the size and what indeed the challenge is that we have to face. And there are a large number of recommendations out there as to how to solve this, and there are some increasing policies and implementations that I wanted to just touch on that will enable a shift towards a much better balanced rewards and recognition system that's not only fairer for scholars, but incentivizes the practices, including open science practices, as we've just talked about, that are going to be so important that we embrace to maximize the benefit of research progress and indeed for society more generally. To achieve, though, that actual shift requires implementation of the policies and recommendations as talked about, including both tools and infrastructures and systems that enable that shift in behavior and practice, as well as we heard earlier, a more fundamental culture change that, as we all know, takes a lot of time and a lot of effort, and indeed requires collective action between key stakeholders and as was just mentioned, between nations as well, which obviously is incredibly challenging to deliver. But looking at the sort of the tools and systems, there's actually already been quite a lot of progress towards creation of tools and systems that encourage and enable early adopters, both from the sort of funders and research institutions and societies through to the researchers themselves, to enable and engage with and start to show benefit of working in a different way and rewarding and recognizing those different practices. So, for example, there are many research funders and institutions, particularly actually in Europe, who have not only signed up to, for example, the DORA principles, that's a Declaration of Research Assessment, but who are starting to actively put those principles into practice. And we just heard some examples of that. And there are a lot of tools out there to help organizations do this. So there are things like the Open Science Career Assessment Matrix, OSCAM for short, and there's lots of frameworks out there to support responsible metrics use, like the Leiden Manifesto, Metric Tide, and many of those. And their aim is really to support the recognition of a much broader range of outputs beyond simply the sort of traditional narrative research article, and hence, as we've just been saying, the journal impact factor and journal brands, but include much broader range of article outputs or more generally outputs, supporting negative and null findings, not just those high impact findings, as well as supporting the sharing of data and code and materials and methods and all sorts of things, as well as, of course, other crucial activities that are essential for a well-functioning academic research system, such as recognition of high quality teaching or peer review activity and much, much more. And I think it's often supported by the fact that in many member states in Europe, there are now these national open science plans that enable the coordination and that collective action across stakeholders that I mentioned earlier. I think is so important in the success of shifting research culture. There's also a huge number of metrics and indicators out there. We're hardly short of them, but what we need to do, I think, is focus on sort of working out what behaviours we want to incentivize and recognise, and then identifying the best tools to do that. Dora and others have been doing quite a lot of work collecting case examples from around the world, many again in Europe, of implementations of more responsible metrics and recognition systems by funders and institutions and others. I think can provide very useful examples for other organisations to look at and understand, well, how did that shift happen? What worked well? How was it implemented? How was it put into practice? At the researcher level, there's an increasing number of infrastructures available, obviously, to support researchers to share this much wider range of output types that I talked about, and therefore to support and enable them to be rewarded and recognised for those by institutions and funders. So you've got, obviously, at a very high level, you've got EOSC, the European Open Science Cloud, supporting researchers in making their data much more fair, so findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, and providing access to obviously a lot of related computational and analytical services and a lot more. And there's a huge range of repositories and tools and services generally available. And a lot of them are starting to work to make sure that not only are the outputs that they capture are citable, but also there are metrics being captured to support and track use and reuse that will enable rewards and recognition systems to actually see what's happening. There's also significant growth in publication models and scholarly infrastructure that's being developed, aimed specifically at supporting different approaches to recognition of researchers' contribution to the scholarly enterprise. So specifically in Europe, for example, you've got Open Research Europe, or ORE, which is the European Commission's open research publishing platform, which we run on their behalf, which is focusing on supporting Horizon 2020 and soon Horizon Europe grantees. And the key focus of the platform is really about enabling that shift in reward and recognition, particularly in terms of supporting sharing and publication and peer review of a much greater range of outputs that a researcher might produce, providing those unique identifiers to support recognition of other activities such as peer review, supporting that interoperability and connectivity between the different research elements and outputs that's so important. So linking, data to code, to materials, to articles, to peer review reports, to grant IDs, and connecting it all together. And then capturing a much broader range of metrics and indicators around all of those outputs and activities and the impact they're having, so that it supports again those institutions and funders in being able to recognise and reward much broader range of outputs and behaviours. As you might expect, we're certainly seeing on Open Research Europe significant uptake by early career researchers who are often keen to engage with systems and provide them with a better way of rewarding and recognising everything that they do. But as I think Kostas mentioned earlier, often feel trapped within evaluation systems that tie them to more traditional approaches around having to focus around journal brand and impact factor. So to go full circle, I think, in my opinion, it's crucial that we actively support early career researchers with policies and assessment systems, obviously, that enable them to receive the recognition they need to grow their careers, but in a fairer way, but also make sure that we're supporting them when they're wanting to engage and adopt some of these newer infrastructures and approaches and tools that enable them to share all our outputs and activities so that they can lead the culture change that we so desperately need for the future. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rebecca. So what I will now do is open up for questions from our audience. in the room and remotely. So I'll keep an eye on the Q&A, and I will encourage people to stand up and walk to the microphone and make a contribution. If you know there's a question and one of you would like to answer it, please go ahead. If not, I will take the liberty to assign it to someone. Professor Petersen, you have a question?
Thank you. Just a comment first. I think there's a fundamental problem, of course, in the sense that we do not actually know how evaluation works, and we don't know whether evaluation actually works. For example, I mean, when we think about grant bodies, and I recently asked the chair of the Wellcome Trust in the UK when I was sitting next to her at the dinner, has anybody ever actually done a real experiment where we tried just to do random allocation of grants and see whether that works as well as the panel structures we have today? We sort of think that this must be the right way to do it, but actually we don't know whether it produces the right results. Similarly, we actually don't know whether our evaluation systems, the current ones, or things that are proposed now, would work actually. Do they actually produce the desired result? Again, is it better than a random selection of people? So there's a fundamental problem in terms of actually research of actually understanding this. So that's one element. In terms of the proposals that are made here, I think there is a problem of qualitative and even quantitative evaluation of teaching, administration, and these things. How do we actually evaluate these? It's all very nice to say that this is important, how to do that. But in terms of teaching, for example, the only evaluation we actually know about is whether students like the teaching or they don't like it effectively. That's what we are left with. Research evaluation has, of course, a long history. And I would just say that the UK's system of research excellence framework is an example where actually impact factors are not used, where citations are only used in a very marginal way and usually only in a positive way. So there is actually a research evaluation system that has been tried now over a number of periods of time, which does not rely on impact factors. However, and that's an important point, behind the rules, of course, there is, of course, the action of individual assessors. And there can easily be a discrepancy between what the rules are and what individual assessors actually decide to do. And I have been publicly very much advocating that one should not use impact factors and that citation is not a good measure. However, one also has to say that there are clearly different standards in different journals in different fields. And even before we knew about impact factors, we knew that there were certain journals which were more weighty than other ones, and that somehow had to be taken into account. So it's a very, very, very difficult issue to deal with. And I think on the one hand, maybe an academy like ours should actually think about some research that actually could cast light on how we evaluate whether it actually is useful to do it, or whether we maybe should be even more radical than some of the things that are talked about today.
Gemma, can I quickly reply to part of this?
Yes, of course.
So thanks, Ole. And it's interesting that you say this, and how if we would randomly distribute funding to people, what the impact would be. Actually, in the Netherlands, we're going to try to do this experiment. So officially, we're not allowed by law, because you have to justify how you distribute money. But we've looked, especially in all these assessment panels, of course, there's always a clear top and a clear bottom, but in the middle is where how you divide this. And even the scientists themselves ask for just random lotteries rather than coming up with arguments why one would or would not be. So we're actually going to do these tests and going to try to see what the effect would be, because it's, of course, very true. And then also what we see with the narrative CV is that we've introduced it. There's a lot of discussion about how to write this, and if this would be then more the people who can communicate and write better, if they would be more advanced. And what we also see is that reviewers of these CVs find it difficult to assess and to compare, and they still Google age factors, etc. So there is there's clear work to set out to instruct everyone how to do this and to come up with ways on how to then compare and assess this. And I fully agree, this is complicated.
I might just respond on randomized controlled trials. I spent 25 years doing them in my own career, and I recognize them as the gold standard in relation to the question of ensuring quality outcomes from research. Of course, we have to take the discussion further these days because we recognize two other important factors in this game. One is the importance of the process being aligned with what society needs. That's the open science agenda, to build trust and to increase efficiency of research. And the third element is impact, ensuring impact and valuing the efforts that researchers make to ensure that what they produce ultimately results in a significant societal benefit. I do recall again in medicine where we came to the conclusion 15 years ago that rather than investing more to find a new cure for diseases, we realized that actual implementation of what we already knew was likely to have far greater impact than any new discoveries. So it is important. Apologies. It is important that the new metrics, the new paradigm, places substantial value on the latter two matters, the nature of the process and efforts to achieve impact of discovery.
Maybe if I can also add into this, I mean, I think it's absolutely right. We need to do more, more testing and more pilots. There's quite a lot of work going on, sort of trying to do more research on research. You've got organizations like Rory in the UK, and you've got others who are trying to do this. And part of the effort that I mentioned that Dora are doing in terms of capturing these case examples of where some implementation has happened is the idea is to try and support others to learn from those. So you can see, if it's an organization similar to your own, what have they done? Did it work? How did they do it? And actually learn from each other to help build up that experience that we need to build. We can't change a whole thing overnight, but we need to start running pilots. I mean, indeed, we talked about the system in the UK. Actually, it was run initially as a pilot alongside the traditional approach. At the same time, they ran two systems and looked and compared that sort of shift towards the more sort of case study approach before sort of shifting over. And the other thing I was just going to comment is, I mean, I think it's absolutely right that, you can have, and welcome will, I've heard this too, we'll say, our policy for a very long time has been don't use impact factors, but actually you go in the grant committees and people often are talking about, they've got more Nature publications or whatever. And so, I mean, I think the other thing we have to do is make sure that we make it easier for people to have access to other information that might help guide them around those decisions, because often all they have got is a list of publications with the name of the journal, and so without additional information that might support them in starting to shift and think about other things they might want to look at, it makes it much harder for people to actually make that shift.
Okay, if you want me to come in also on this last issue of people looking at impact factors, even though the policy is not to look at impact factors, yes, they will continue to look at impact factors because old habits die hard. But you have to, this is the change of culture we're talking about. It doesn't mean anything, this. We have to continue to persevere, and eventually, as it has happened in so many other areas of human activity over the centuries, eventually, if it is a bad practice and something that we all agree should be abolished, then eventually people will stop doing it. About the question of that was asked by Professor Peterson regarding teaching and administrative activities, that how do you value them and so on, it is a good question, but a bit orthogonal, I think, to the research assessment. So we have identified, I think, a particular challenge in research assessment because it doesn't happen the right way. It happens in a way that does not favor quality of science, everything that Michael Murphy said earlier. So we need to correct this. At the same time, in the context of academic assessment, not research assessment, academic assessment, you have many other dimensions. In addition to research, you may want to assess teaching, you may want to assess contribution to the administration of the university, or how effective you are in bringing funds to the university and things like that, entrepreneurship in some universities. So, but this is the issue of how each university will structure and will evaluate the academic performance. But so it is easy to confuse the two, research assessment with academic assessment. So I think we need to be careful. But this being a meeting of YAE, I come to my previous, to what I said earlier. Monique, I think in the Netherlands, if I remember correctly, when the change was happening, and you are right that the Netherlands is probably the most advanced country, or has the most advanced institutions and funders in that respect. But when the change was happening, there was a letter a few years ago, I don't remember when it was, 2 years ago, I think, by 170 senior scientists against the change, right? And temporarily,
there was another letter this summer in the Dutch newspapers. Yeah.
Okay, and temporarily it stopped, temporarily, until a letter from 400 young scientists came saying the opposite, arguing in favor of the change. And this unblocked again, I mean, gave ammunition, gave fuel to this reform, and it happened at the end.
Yeah.
So
yeah, and in the summer the same exchange happened again, and now this
Okay.
process is not going to be stopped. But it's polarizing the discussion a little bit, of course, young versus senior. We somehow need to constructively discuss this together rather than via writing letters in newspapers.
Absolutely.
But yeah.
But it's inevitable that it happens. You know, always something new comes clashes with part of the old, not all of the old, but part of it. The part of the old that doesn't want to change. So to some extent, it's inevitable. That's why we are advocating to create a movement, a pan-European movement of this with its own dynamic. Yes, the pilots are very good and we should continue. We have been funding for 10 years, giving money to institutions to try it out. You know, we call them the projects of institutional change. We have been doing so many things, but it's not going to change again until the young or the early career scientists make their voice loudly heard, and two, again, until a movement, a real movement that progressively grows, swells, and then it becomes unstoppable, is created on the basis of these principles. So, and again, I think all early career researchers have a very important role to play in creating this movement.
Thank you all. So talking about great things from the Netherlands, Siert has a comment.
Yeah, not so much from the Dutch perspective, but more from a contextual perspective, following up also on the points raised by Ola. I think it is important to realize that there are, of course, differences between the different fields in terms of the way they do an evaluation. It's quite a difference between the way evaluations are done in social science and humanities, and how it is done in, for example, life sciences or physical sciences and engineering. And even in a field like physical sciences and engineering, where I have been domain coordinator for PE in the ERC, I saw very big differences. So in that sense, there is not a uniformity here. It's very important, of course, to do it in a way that serves the field and that takes also into account the richness of the field in directions which basically are not present in all the fields at the same time. There's also the issue of the point of competition between individual researchers and collaborative bottom-up research initiatives. And that also has to do sometimes with competition between the institutions. To give you an example, we have seen in the recent past situations where bottom-up initiatives for collaborative research in, for example, research schools, national research schools, basically were terminated because of competition between individual universities in their drive to get higher up in, for example, the Shanghai Index. So I think these are very important things to address. Finally, as the Young Academy was born as an initiative of ESC starting grantees, I would be very curious to know how, for example, Gemma and Moniek are seeing basically the directions that the ESC should take in future evaluations. Because also there, of course, it is a very competitive scheme. It works, it is a jewel in the crown. But at the same time, in terms of widening European participation, and also in terms of fostering collaborative research involving, let's say, cooperation between individuals, it's not at its strongest. And of course, we have the synergy grants, but again, that is involving, let's say, up to 4 PIs. But again, that's a different thing than some of the things we clearly need to address issues where you need really a group of researchers, including also people maybe who are not in the most high-ranking journals, but which are indispensable. So how do we find here a balance? And of course, it's very important to come up with a system that will work. Because if, with all the best intentions, schemes are invented that will basically lead to stagnation, then of course we are basically back to a situation which was a situation when I entered as a student, that there was basically hardly any evaluation. And I think we have seen an improvement of the quality due to the evaluation schemes that have been introduced, but we also see the need to make some surgery. So I'm very curious about your views on this.
Thank you, Seert. I don't know, Monique, if you want to take this one or...
Yeah, I guess we can both say something. I mean, within the ISE, we are working with a lot of organizations and we've just written a white paper on both open science as well as research careers, and they're kind of interconnected. So they link the open science and the research careers to recognition and rewarding. And Maria Leptin, the new ERC president, was very involved in all of this. And so these discussions are happening at the ERC level where, as far as I know, this narrative CV, for example, is now also being discussed. So I guess a lot of people have high hopes of Maria on this place to see how this will change the ERC system. But I agree, it's a tricky balance to have, on the one hand, this research excellence, personal research excellence grants, which are prestigious and well recognized, towards team science. It might need new instruments, but it is all under discussion and it's very well recognized, I think, although not everyone at the ERC in the scientific panel agree on the new directions. So that's interesting as well.
Yes,
this is true. If I may, Gemma, all this is absolutely true. The ERC does have only narrative CVs. You have to have up to 5 publications maximum, and you have to say what you consider great about them. You cannot list all your publications, so on. And open science practices, I don't remember exactly how, but in the evaluation process, they are taken into account. So in other words, if you have a good track record, or if you integrate, let's say, open data, data management, looking for previous data on the same topic and so on, such things in your proposal, this is evaluated positively, but I cannot tell you exactly how. The principles underlying the ERC and the rest of the Commission programs are the same. So the ERC has specific modalities, specific types of projects and so on, but the basic principles are not different, and including open access to publications on which we had very long discussions with the Scientific Council of the ERC, but now it's settled and it is the full open access as we have it in the Commission.
Thank you, Kostas. Yes, I think, of course, the conversation can go a little bit wider than the specific topic. I mean, if we can talk about the value of personal fellowship awards or personal grant awards like ERCs, are we starting grants or consolidated? Are we moving away from these? Is there still a value? I mean, in terms of the evidence, they have made a difference and improved research and development in Europe. So of course, there is a value, but so if we keep them, how do we evaluate them? And is there room in the application? What do we ask of applicants? How do we still keep this? What is an excellence marker to make sure this person can take their vision to a next stage and create a nice group? So in the case of the Wellcome Trust that was mentioned by Ole, I'm based in the UK. I recently applied for one of the fellowships, and indeed, you know, it's moved to a narrative CVE. You are asked about name 5 people you've recently mentored and where, you know, what did they do and where are they now? Your contribution the last 5 years was not asked to offer a CV. So there is a change from some funders driving this, but there's also a conversation about how do we, if we help people spend 5 years focused on their research, how are we making sure they are team players at the end of the day? So it's a wider question. Harvey, I think you had a question as well.
Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank you for articulating the issues that I'm a rector of my university, and I face these dilemmas every day. Okay, and we're trying to work through and think about how we deal with issues that have to do with promotion and hiring. And I think the two are very, very different. Okay, and here I think there has to be some sort of differentiation between promotion after you've been hired and hiring. When hiring is a very complicated issue, because hiring also puts, particularly in certain disciplines, puts an enormous financial onus on the university, because we know that set up packages for young, outstanding scientists, particularly in particular fields, can be incredibly expensive. And we have to think about how we manage that, and how we, you know, we have to take every university, I guess, takes risks, right, about who they hire, because the person is coming from a postdoc, and you hope that the postdoc has begun to show independence and everything else. How do you judge that? Okay, how do you decide who you're going to hire and who not? I also like to say that there is an incredible difference between disciplines. Okay, and again, the measurements that are used and how you measure different disciplines are incredibly different. And I know, because I chair our promotion committee, right, just how different a file in the humanities is, and Sild said something about that just before, and how different a file is in the humanities, right, or social sciences from a file, and the expectations from a file in the exact sciences or medicine or engineering. Okay, so that's also a broad issue which I think has to be taken into account, and I don't think there's not one shoe that fits right, that fits every foot and every possibility. The other thing is that, and I think this has to be taken into account, that there's an enormous amount of different players on the field. Okay, for example, I don't know in Israel. Okay, the way, and I guess in other European countries too, but the way the universities are funded is we're public universities, so we're funded by the government, is very, very much based right, on a research model, which has absolutely nothing to do with academic quality and everything to do with quantity. It's anti-academic in every way, but we have to play in that, we have to play on that football field and on the field, because if we don't, we won't be able to hire new researchers or pay the wages of the researchers that we have. So again, reform is needed, but it's incredibly complex because there are so many different, and I haven't even begun to talk about the, we talked about it earlier today, Ole and I, the publishers and the amount of pressure and lobbyists that they have to make sure that we all continue trying to look for those people who publish in Science and Nature and Cell and all those other high impact, supposedly high impact factor journals. So thank you. I don't know if I have a question here, but I'm just throwing out that there's so many different variables, right? That I think it's very, very difficult to try and come to one sort of or any sort of policy which will answer all the different problems that we have as university rectors. I'm talking now as a rector who has to, on the one hand, we want to hire the best researchers, but on the other hand, I also have to make sure we have the funding to do so.
Thank you.
I suppose, Harvey, two comments. The first one on your first comment about the difference between hiring and promoting and the complexity of that. Perfection is the enemy of the good. I think the consensus is that what we have been doing has most certainly not been perfect, and it hasn't been good. And all we can aspire to do is to bring about the levers to support the change that we all know must happen. That's Kostas's point. The coalition of the willing is the next very important development in this field. On the second point, I've forgotten my, yes, it is your challenge in relation to university perspective. It's very simple again. My view is that if we don't do what we know must happen, it's going to be done to us. And our lesson through history has been that institutional autonomy is squeezed continually to a large degree because we haven't ourselves put sufficient energy into bringing about the change. And that is largely within our power. So when we set out Universities Without Walls 6 months ago, we were basically saying, we see what the challenges are, we know what must happen, and we must actually do it because society needs us to and expects us to. Not going to be easy, but Kostas sitting in Brussels and his member state ministries will demand that we make change if we don't do it ourselves. Political statement.
Actually, if I can follow up with Costa, so that coalition, I apologize if I missed it, is the coalition of evaluators and funders. Will young researcher associations, young academic associations be able to have a saying? Can we participate into the offering our views? Would that be welcome?
Definitely. Definitely, it would be welcome. Okay, we have been discussing with many of you, and they would be welcome certainly into the coalition. But more than this, it is not just being welcome. It is how can young researchers play a catalyzing role in this coalition? How can they be, the motor of going forward? One idea, for instance, that we have been discussing, I mean, no decisions have been taken about this because it's a coalition of the willing, as Michael said. It is the willing should come together and take their own decisions. It is not for me or somebody else to decide. But one issue that we have been discussing is whether young researchers or early career research associations should have a particular role in monitoring progress in the different institutions. So in other words, say, this employer, this institution is in their coalition or has signed out DORA, but look, they request such things for someone to get his promotion. So, or in some other way being involved in the monitoring of progress. But to reply to you again, it is certainly, or not only they should be involved in, they should be in the lead, but to have to find the exact way of how this can happen together.
And beyond that, Kostas, if I might add, because we are in academia operating at a global scale, it isn't just what happens in Europe that happens. It's what happens particularly in those parts of the world where talent is mobile between Europe, North America, and Asia. And so just to say that at the EUA, we are very conscious of this reality, and we are taking steps to sit down in a common forum with the major university representative bodies across the globe, all continents. And this item is #1 on EUA's agenda for an upcoming meeting, because the Netherlands worries about first mover disadvantage. Europe should also worry about first mover disadvantage, and we've got to manage that element, the global aspect of this, in parallel.
Yeah, that's great. If I may add to this, this is absolutely great that universities do that, global scale. Funders, to some extent, have started through the Global Research Council that already discussed research assessment in a meeting late in 2020, and now they plan further work on this. We are participating as Commission, as a funder. And then at the government level, we are working with the US and Canada on this in the context of the G7. And then we were very glad with the UNESCO declaration that on open science that addresses many elements of this. Of course, it will take years. Okay, UNESCO is extremely heterogeneous, but still, it gives a signal that its time is coming.
I think
yes, we have 3 questions here.
Sorry. I think it's very good if we are thinking about global sense, but I think a lot of things has to be done in European scale. And still, we have a lot of problem here. There are countries which are having really very little chance to get grants, ERC grants. I was at the ERC Vice President and Life Science Domain Coordinator, and I could see that actually during the last 10 years, nothing happened, or very little thing happened. And still, the non-EU countries or the new member states, they can get only 3% of the ERC budget. So something is wrong with the evaluation system. And I could see also that some panels worked on a way looking which are the applications where you have the highest impact factor, more citations, which should not be actually the basis of evaluation, but still this is in the panels, and automatically they evaluated at higher points, those ones which are coming from very nice journal, very nice labs. So actually some countries do not have even the chance really to compete in this competition. The other thing that in the different countries, there are different evaluation systems. I could see that in Hungary, there was very good evaluation panel, international expert, it worked perfectly. Now the whole thing changed. This is maybe a political decision, and they are only evaluating those proposals where you had certain impact factors and certain high quality publication. They do not even see, don't read even the applications which do not reach this standard, which means that the young ones who are not at this stage do not have even the chance to apply for a grant, because this is already eliminated. When I was working at asked for by the Volkswagen Stiftung, they are evaluating also the proposals where you do not know who is applying. The name is not known. They should not give their publications there. So you only evaluate really the proposal. And finally, it worked very nicely. So they could get very nice results out of this one. At the ERC, we were also thinking, it was a few years ago, maybe 5 years ago, to make a parallel evaluation. When one with the normal procedure and the same applications without telling the names and without the publication. Finally, it was not done, but it is a question how it would work. But I think it's not normal that 97% of the budget is always going to the same countries, and there are no way to give chance for other young talents or any other talent from other countries. So I think we have to do a lot of things in Europe and in the European research area before we go to the global scale.
So do you think the reform, the changing rewards and recognitions would help towards that?
I think if you could work out some kind of guidelines or standard procedure, which would eliminate all these problems, not all, but the majority of the problems, it could help. And this should be accepted by the member states or the European research area to use the same type of evaluation for everybody.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we see that in discussions in the YAE as well, that scientists from certain countries have much more difficulties, but also, so not just to get funding, but also opportunities within their university, limited budget, limited instrumentation in their university. So they have less, well, how do you say that, less to offer in a proposal as well, which that is also something we need to work on. And we have a lot of discussion within YAE, but also within ISE, etc., on how we, and of course, Academia Europaea is doing that and the EU is doing that on this widening participation. But I agree that this is something we need to tackle as well.
Thank you, Monique. We have, might be our last question. From Professor Alexander Fedora.
It will be a quick question and maybe not a popular one, but still I want to address the issue because so far we have only been speaking about ex ante evaluation. And maybe there is a consensus about not speaking about ex post evaluation. But I think this is an important topic, or for me, it should be an important topic because it is about transparency and also about transparency with regard to society. And maybe it also leads into a more continuous process of evaluation where now we just have evaluation at very decisive points to get into something. And once you're into something, this kind of runs on its own. And I'm wondering whether a certain degree of ex post evaluation would help to balance some of the problems that we are addressing here. For instance, with the ERC, but also with other funding schemes. I know that this is lots of problems, of course, but still I wanted to address the issue.
Of course.
If you want me to comment, I see ex post evaluation applying to not only to funders and research programs, but also to institutions. In other words, institutions reward the professors when they get the money in, but seldom, from what I hear, from what I know, reward them for spending well the money after they had them. There are checks, but the impact they make with the money, it's usually not evaluated, but it's very good to bring the money in, of course. Same thing with the funders. So a lot of emphasis in who will get the money, but once you get the money, then there is less emphasis in the evaluation. So I agree with the comment. There are reviews, of course, you know, and in the past, in the Commission, we had reviews every 6 months. In the then it went every year. Now once only in the middle of the project and once at the end. So there is an evaluation, but maybe it should this should be changed. It should not, however, result in bureaucracy and the huge overheads in continuously having to justify yourself. Why did you do something this way, not another way? So if there is, it's a good point for discussion, but if there is a way that evaluations take place so that everybody learns from them and things are done better next time, yes. But if the overhead for this is high, I would say no.
I would like to add that actually this exists at the ERC. So randomly they select projects, and this is evaluated 2 years after the termination of the ERC grant. And actually, the selected projects were very good. We don't know what would have happened. Those projects which were not selected, but actually those ones which got financing, they were evaluated. And they had different rankings, but usually 70% of the projects really brought excellent results. So it was worth to support them.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, with this, we got to the end of our session. I want to thank everyone who contributed to making this an interactive discussion. It's definitely a complicated topic, but there's a willingness, at least from what I sense, that there's a willingness, if it can be improved, if we can make this more equitable, let's try and find a way. So I want to thank you all, Professor Murphy, for coming all the way here, and the Academia Europaea for hosting our session. And I'll now pass on to Professor Eva Condorossi, who will be introducing the next section. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.